Hello everyone, and welcome to the Think Inc. podcast. I'm Susie, owner and director of Think Inc. At Think Inc., we elevate ideas through live events, and here is a showcase of our online live event series, Outside the Box. Today's show is with Yasmine Mohammed. She is a Canadian human rights activist who advocates for the rights of women living within Islamic majority countries, as well as those who struggle under religious fundamentalism. She's also the founder of Free Hearts, Free Minds, an organization that provides psychological support for free thinkers living within Muslim majority countries, where the state-sanctioned punishment for leaving Islam is death. Her book, Unveiled, is a memoir that recalls her experiences growing up in a fundamentalist Islamic household and her arranged marriage to a member of Al-Qaida. In it, she sheds light on the religious trauma that so many women still today are unable to discuss. Yasmine is a hero and someone I greatly admire, and I know you will too. Today's show is hosted by the brilliant Gemma Tognini, who is an opinion columnist for the West Australian, SMH and the Daily Telegraph, as well as a key contributor on Sky News. I hope you all enjoy the show.
I wanted to start the conversation, if we could, by taking you back to the beginning. Can you give, for those who may not have had an opportunity to read your book Unveiled, or who may not yet have had the opportunity to really understand your story, perhaps you could give us a little bit of a condensed version, if that's even possible, about how you went from a young girl in that marriage that you detail in the book to this global advocate for women with no voice.
Yeah, that's an interesting journey, isn't it? How do you go from being the wife of an Al-Qaida agent to becoming an outspoken critic of Islam? It was a long journey. I have not been married to him for a very long time, and it's been a lot of years of therapy and introspection and just going through my own long journey. And really, it wasn't until a Bill Maher episode with Ben Affleck and Sam Harris that motivated me to speak out. So what happened in that episode was basically Bill Maher and Sam Harris were talking about how people from Muslim majority countries, specifically they were talking about in Egypt, how over 80% of people in Egypt feel that people who leave Islam should be executed. And that was speaking directly to me because my family is from Egypt and I left Islam. And so I was just absolutely over the moon elated that these men are talking about me on national television. You know, this is a topic that's never been talked about before in the general media. People, you know, in Bangladesh are being hacked to death in the streets at the time, and nobody was talking about it. And it was really, really disheartening, to put it mildly, to find Ben Affleck shutting these men down. And then to add insult to injury, after that, I saw all of my friends on Facebook supporting Ben Affleck and saying, oh, you know, it's so good that he was there to shut down those gross and racist men.
That's a really important place to pause, because it sort of speaks to the heart of our conversation today around this almost apologist position that liberals in the West, not just in the media, but definitely in celebrity, liberals in the West, and here in Australia, we would call that people on the left of politics, not liberals, because the term obviously means a different thing here. This seeming free pass, I guess you could describe it as, a free pass culturally, politically, I'm reticent to say for Islam, because we know not all aspects of Islam are extreme, just like not all aspects of Christianity or Catholicism or Judaism are extreme, but in particular, the criticism reserved for elements of other faiths that are, for example, perpetuating the control of women, the subjugation of women. It's open season. It's open season. And yet we simply don't see that in Islam. And I feel like that's certainly something that you have challenged. But today we want to unpack the why behind that. And there is so much, like it's almost like a rabbit hole. Was there ever a starting point for you around that?
I think the starting point for me was probably my personal experience being a woman and a Muslim, and being raised to accept the fact that women are less intelligent than men, because that's what the religion teaches. To accept the fact that a man, if he fears that his wife might be disobedient or arrogant, that he can beat her. I could go on and on, that a woman, whether she likes it or not, if her man wants to have sex with her, she has to agree. So basically sanctioning marital rape. So all of those parts of the religion I knew as a Muslim woman growing up, but I didn't dare fight against them because, as far as I was concerned, it was the creator of the universe, the Almighty, right, was the one who created these laws. So who am I to fight against that?
And you would have been conditioned from a young age.
Exactly. You actually feel guilty for questioning these edicts. You feel you're shamed because if I say something like, how could Muhammad have married a 6-year-old? How could he have slept with her when she was 9 years old? Isn't that pedophilia? And I would get in trouble for asking those questions. I'm a little girl myself, and I'm hearing about a 53-year-old man essentially raping a 9-year-old girl, and I can't question that. Otherwise, that makes me a bad person because I'm questioning Allah's chosen person.
So let's just unpick that for a second, because those conversations in Australian media, you can't even have them. And you can't have them without being called culturally insensitive. You can't have them without being called Islamophobic, all of that sort of stuff. I want to pivot for one sec. Some of you watching today may have seen the docu-series, it's not a documentary, but it's based on a true story on Netflix at the moment called Unorthodox. I'm not sure if you've seen it, Yasmine, as well, but it's a fantastic. I mean, I binge watched it over a weekend, and it tells the story of a young Hasidic Jewish woman who escapes the same sort of circumstances on the flip side, as in she's a member of born into this very strict, controlling Jewish sect where young girls aren't educated. They are not given an education. They are born to be married. They are born to reproduce the 6 million lost in the Holocaust. It was an absolutely riveting, confronting, disturbing thing to watch. And yet, though, the modern media is free to criticise, as they should, may I say, as they should, because that deserves to be criticised. But I can't remember the last time I saw a similar program made based on Islam. Is it because, unlike Judaism, Islam in itself is a political system as much as it is a faith?
That's a question that I've thought about a lot, and I really don't have a good answer for it, other than people on the left here think of Jewish people as white, even though, the whole reason why the Holocaust happened was because they specifically are not white. But anyway, they are viewed as white right now. So they are viewed as the oppressor, as all white people are right now, if you're on the left. And those who don't have white skin are considered the victims. They are the ones that are being oppressed. So from my perspective, what I'm thinking is the reason why they're happy to speak up in support of women who are coming from fundamentalist Christian backgrounds. They are happy to speak up for women that are coming from Orthodox Jewish backgrounds, but they will not speak up for women who are coming from fundamentalist Muslim backgrounds. And I think that might be because those women happen to have darker skin, honestly. It's a shocking thing for people from the left who are supposedly the non-racists, but really that's what it is. Muslims are considered people of color, and therefore the women within Islam have to just accept their culture the way it is. They can't push for progress in the same way every other woman in the Western world can and has pushed for progress.
It's a really confronting thing to hear you say, because if it's that simple, then we have so far to go. I mean, in the last week, you would have seen the same coverage, hopefully the same coverage, albeit nowhere near as enough of a young girl in Iran being, there was an honor killing, and she's a young, 14-year-old girl killed by her father. That is 2020. Right. And if that had been, I guess, any other young girl, any other social group, ethnicity, we would have seen a very different reaction. So the structure of the mainstream media, we're seeing this parallel currently going on in the United States. We know that there is a conversation around race, and in a country like Australia, we definitely have entrenched racism, very, very different from what we see in America. But the narrative pushed and the polarization of the media in America is so much more significant than what we're seeing here. How much of a role do you think that really aggressive polarization of media in the States, in terms of an agenda setter, is to blame for this?
Unfortunately, they have a huge part of the blame. I mean, not just the media as far as journalists, but the media like television and movies and advertisements and magazines and all sorts of media that people are consuming. There seems to be this fetishization of fundamentalist aspects of Islam. And I definitely put that straight on the media's lap for doing that, because they would not do the same thing if it was fundamentalist aspects from any other religion. They just simply wouldn't. They would recognize it as something that is anti-woman and something that is misogynist and something that they should not be supporting. I think that race is a huge part of this. Identity politics is a huge part of this. Grouping people as Black people good, white people bad, Muslim people good, Jewish people bad, that is incredibly simplistic. It's childish. It feels like a Walt Disney movie where the good guy's going to wear a white hat and the bad guy's going to wear a black hat. That's not the way it is in real life. In real life, we are all human beings and we are all on a spectrum. And it's really difficult even to talk about Muslims because there are over 1 billion of them. And some Muslims are my friends that I love, that I would do anything for. And some Muslims I want absolutely nothing to do with, and I hope to never see them again for the rest of my life.
I want to ask you, in your work, in your professional day-to-day life, these conversations, is there a sense of resignation around this liberal media infatuation with the extremes of Islam? Is there a sense of resignation around it? Is there a sense of we must do something about it? Is there any sense of even acknowledging, I suppose, that there is a significant issue that needs to be addressed? For example, in my world, when I'm writing columns and I'm dealing with clients and you're just sort of interacting with day-to-day people, because we know that sections of the media operate in a bubble. We all operate to an extent in a bubble, but my world and your world is a little bit more inclusive. I feel like I'm not just interacting with one group of people day in, day out, and neither are you. But the interesting conversations that I have is that there is this sense of, well, there isn't anything wrong with this. And it's that whole, which women do we decide to advocate for and which women are we happy to just discard and leave to the circumstances in which they were born?
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree with you. Because if you're thinking of, feminist, like ex-Muslim women or women from a Muslim background, or even people like Asra Nomani or Raheel Reza, who are still Muslims that are pushing for progress within their religion, then there is a lot of frustration. They are just infuriated. They are angry. They are trying their hardest to get these messages out. But it's absolutely falling on deaf ears. And I completely agree with you that from my perspective, the liberal media seem to not even notice. They seem to not even care. And they just continue to shovel more and more on us. And they're completely oblivious to the fact that we're screaming and saying, can you please stop? I mean, they're not even noticing that case of the young 14-year-old girl that's beheaded by her father. I didn't see that in mainstream media. The women in Iran that are being imprisoned because they refused to wear the hijab that they're being forced to wear. You're not hearing anything about that in mainstream media. Yeah, it's really, really hurtful too, I think, is what it comes down to. Because, I remember this Sam Harris TED Talk where he was talking about young girls from a Mormon community that were being married off, like in polygamous relationships. And the FBI went in there and they yanked those girls out of that cult. And we don't have that same kind of energy when we're talking about young girls from Islam. Even though the young girls there could be dealing with FGM, they could be dealing with forced marriage. It doesn't matter. Like in my book, I talk about how it went through everything, the police system, the child services system, the court system. And eventually I got to see a judge and he knew everything that had happened to me, all of the physical abuse, all of the mental abuse, all of the sexual assault. And in the end, it was like, this is your lot in life. This is what's acceptable in your family. This is I'm being culturally sensitive.
That sort of touches on the point that I think struck me as I was reading your book. Your book's a very difficult read, and difficult because it's confronting and powerful. This is the point I was sort of trying to explore before around the cultural stuff, right? So the judge in your case, for whatever reason, who knows what was going through their head, decided not to rescue a young girl who had been subject to terrible, terrible abuse. Any other ethnicity, faith group, whatever, as you said, you would have been pulled straight out and put into care. There is no question around that. Does this come back to the concept of law, of the entrenched system of Sharia law, and that even though in every Western democracy, just as in Australia, canon law, the law of the Catholic Church, should not be above common law. So, the law of the Australian government is the law of the Australian people, whatever faith you're at. So it seems to me that, is it fear? Is it fear of backlash? Is it timidity? I mean, what anecdotally, what are people in your network telling you?
Well, I had a lot of people who read my book who confided in me that they used to work as social workers. That used to be their career. And they had to walk away from children like me so many times, or children from the Aboriginal community, or, any child that was non-white had to be left in their abusive circumstances for the sake of cultural relativity. The people that were contacting me were genuinely haunted, Gemma, haunted by the faces of these kids, that they had to say, no, sorry, we can't help you. We're just going to leave you in the situation that you're in, knowing full well that if that child had blue eyes and blonde hair, that they would be able to save that kid from the abuse that they were living under. So it was just too difficult for a lot of these people, and they have to actually change careers because there's no way to change that system.
So that's incredibly important, because in the last couple of years here in Australia, we've been having the same conversation around Indigenous children, particularly in the Northern Territory, where there have been some absolutely horrendous cases of abuse, toddlers being sexually assaulted so badly that they ended up in hospital, high degree of STDs amongst young children. And there is this tiptoeing around the issue of removing a child, and it's this concept of, why can't we be colorblind in relation to the welfare of a child? Why can't leaders simply be brave enough to say it doesn't matter what ethnicity, what race group, what color that child's skin is? As you've said, if that child was blonde hair and blue-eyed, it would be out of that at-risk situation, in 30 seconds flat. So it seems as if this concept of racism is actually very, very deep in the heart of the issues that you're trying to confront. It's just a different 100%. Manifestation. Racism that we've grown up to see and to understand is the racism that resulted in the death of a man in America this week. In Australia, it was Indigenous Australians, obviously. Then as the post-war migrant wave came through, as Greeks, Italians, Chinese, Vietnamese, denied them work, denied them housing, opportunity, social advancement, that kind of racism. We've never had a discussion around the racism that keeps a woman or a child confined to a situation that would not be tolerated for a child who was not of color.
And the difference is, this new racism is so much more insidious because it's coming from people who are insisting that they are the virtuous ones, that they are so anti-racism. And that's why the perfect microcosm of this is how our prime minister has like 3 images of him throughout the years where he was covered in blackface. So that is the person that is insisting that he is so not racist and is constantly admonishing the Canadian public for being racist. So, that's the thing, like, as somebody who has received racism from both sides, I can tell you that at least when it's somebody who is, a white supremacist type of person, they are direct. They are honest. They are angry at me for marrying a white man. They are angry at me for ruining his bloodline and having a child that is mixed. They're direct, at least. They are at least direct. But when I have somebody from the left being racist to me, it is so much more insidious, and it's so much more slippery, and it's so much harder to put your finger on and to allow them to see how what they are doing is so much worse than what's even coming from this side. Because at least from what's coming from the other side, I can see it coming. I understand it, and it makes sense to me. But from the left, they have like this armor that they have created for themselves to believe that they are the virtuous ones. They believe that they are the non-racist ones. And then they do things like what that judge did, which is to be incredibly, severely, disgustingly, viciously racist towards me. And that's just my experience, right? Like all of the girls that are suffering from FGM and no parents have ever been prosecuted. What about those girls? If, again, I have to say it, if a white family took a razor blade to their daughter's genitals, those parents would not be free people today. They would be considered sociopaths, and they would be behind bars. And when you talk about being colorblind, when we're talking about protecting children, the law is for everybody. It's one law for all. Why is one child more valuable than another child? I don't understand how their minds work, that they think that it's better to leave a child in a abusive, in a sexually assaulting family. Like, how is that ever, how do they sleep at night?
This is coming sort of not full circle, but it links into what we're talking about, because these conversations are not freely had, and they're not honestly had. They're had with a timidity, and they're had within the context of, it's cultural. I mean, my father was Italian. He's from the north of Italy, slightly more liberal, culturally more liberal than the south of Italy. But I remember growing up in my early careers in my 20s, and there was a young girl who worked with me in the first job that I had in a newsroom, and she was from a Sicilian family, very traditional Italian family. She was in her 20s. She was an adult. She was working. She was not allowed to leave the house on weekends unless her brother supervised her. She was not allowed to basically live an adult life as a young woman in her 20s without the constant supervision of a male relative. Now, that's an extreme example of Italian Catholic culture, right? But I remember we all tiptoed around it. I'm not suggesting there was any harm perpetrated on her. To be honest, I wouldn't know. But I remember thinking, oh my God, how, it's whatever, it was 1990, whatever at the time. And she's in her 20s and she's working, and she still hasn't got the freedom to go out for dinner on a Friday night unless there's a bloke with her. And those are the conversations that are always treated with timidity. To your point about identity politics, Yasmine, we're afraid of being called, you're a racist, you are Islamophobe, you are anti-Semitic, you are all of these things. To say that, it is not right that the Hasidic community should not educate young women, to say it is not right for young Hasidic Jewish women to be confined to a life of no choice, no education, all of that kind of thing. You are labeled. Perhaps as a community, we need to gird our loins, Yasmine. We need to get some courage up to be able to face those labels and say, no, I'm not.
And that's the only answer. That's the only way to solve this, is for people to just be strong and to just continue talking. And an extreme example of what happens when you don't continue talking is the rape gangs in the UK. They were only allowed to continue. They perpetuated for so many years, and thousands of girls across the country, some girls as young as 11. Why? How did that happen? The answer is because the authorities were too scared to speak up. So because they're afraid that people might call them bad words, instead, because what they're trading that for, they're saying, I'll protect myself from somebody calling me bad words, and therefore you're allowing that girl to get raped. That's what people don't understand, is when you are silenced, there's a cost to that. When jihadis go around and they murder the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists, and then it causes you to bite your tongue because you don't want to criticize Islam, or what they did to Salman Rushdie, or et cetera, et cetera. There's so many cases of them getting angry at criticism. But if you bite your tongue, then they have achieved their goal. They have succeeded. You are allowing them to win. And what's worse is you're empowering and you are allowing that oppression to continue. And you know what? It reaches you. It's not just over there. We can't just look at Afghani girls and Saudi girls and Iranian girls and say, oh, that's happening over there. That's not happening over here. I'm born and raised in Canada. I know girls from Australia that were put in niqab, covering their faces from the age of 10 and 11 years old. Girls that today will speak with an accent because they only went to Islamic schools and they didn't even get to interact with the wider Australian community. They're happening now. They're happening here in your own backyard. And we know this, right? Like, we know when ISIS started up their caliphate, there were people from all over the planet burning their passports and going and joining them. We don't have the luxury anymore of saying it's none of our business. It's happening over there. No, it is our business. These are our girls. These are our neighbors. They are in our schools. They are friends with our children. We have every right to get involved in this conversation. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is people feel like it's none of my business. It's their community. But that's a very selfish way to look at the world around you. If I see a child being hurt, I'm not going to wonder to myself, oh, but what community is that child from? And what kind of backlash could I receive from it? You need to speak up for people.
And to that point, it is, when you said just before, we can no longer afford to say it's not my business. That goes for the everyday, seemingly banal example, and it goes for the extreme example. It goes for the young girl who is, even in an abusive relationship. Let's just take it outside the box a little bit further. We don't talk about domestic violence enough. We don't talk about women who might have that boyfriend who, you suspect something's going on. We don't even have the courage as a community on the surface of it to have those conversations. So being able to have a conversation at the other end of the spectrum, what's your view? How do we get from a place where we go, you're a friend of mine, I'm worried that you're in an abusive relationship, or I'm worried that your parents are overbearing with you. That's the bottom level stuff. How on earth do we get from there and doing that well to going, that child is abused, that young girl is in a cult, or or whatever? How do we get there?
Well, you don't even have to speculate. If somebody like me, who is putting herself at the mercy of the court and saying, help me, get me out of this situation, then for example, this is somebody that you can help. When there are women all over the world risking their lives and being imprisoned and being attacked with acid and being killed by their families, and they're screaming for help, then we don't have to speculate. Do they need help or not? Is this a touchy subject or not? No, they are saying, yes, we are fighting against these oppressive regimes. And you have the option of either supporting them or ignoring them. But what tends to happen is this third choice, which I just can't even imagine that it would even be a choice. But the third choice that ends up happening is the subtitle of my book, is they end up actually empowering radical Islam. They end up empowering the people that are oppressing these women.
So this is coming from an article published April 28th in The Conversation. And is the face mask used to help block the coronavirus, which many of us are using right now, really that different from a niqab? Both garments are worn for specific purposes in a specific place for a specific time. Once the purpose is over, the mask and niqab come off. The calling of the sacred motives, some to wear the niqab. A highly infectious disease propels many to wear face masks. If we all start wearing masks, does it mean we've succumbed to a form of oppression? I mean, Yasmine, my original reaction when I saw this quote was I just thought it was satire. Honestly could not believe that this would be serious, but it is. And this is from a liberal left-leaning publication, and it's essentially saying that it's the same thing. Keeping yourself safe from a deadly pandemic is the same as a tool of oppression.
That's literally like saying handcuffs are handcuffs. If a police is putting it on you, or whether you're into BDSM and you're putting it on your partner. Yes, handcuffs are handcuffs. but obviously the context matters. It is such a simplistic, I can't understand how people aren't even ashamed to make that equation to somehow equate a niqab and a face mask. They are both face coverings, and that's exactly where it ends. There is a different purpose. I mean, my God, doesn't the purpose matter? One is being worn to protect you from a global pandemic, and one is girls are told you have to wear it to protect you from getting raped. There's a very big difference between the two. If you don't wear a mask, you're not being told that you're going to burn in hell for eternity. You're not being told that you're a filthy, dirty whore, right? Like there's so much rape culture and misogyny and just filthy ideas for men and women surrounding the niqab.
I want to ask you a question, Yasmine. When you interact, first of all, how much interaction have you had with left-leaning media, whether it's here or in your global travels and your global speaking? And when you interact with them, what is the degree of pushback? Is there a dismissiveness? I'm curious to know what that looks like for you.
So if I'm getting invited on, then I always feel like, okay, so it means that they're probably open to hearing my perspective. But quite often I feel like they're inviting me on to just continue. Like I don't know if by the end of our conversation their minds have been opened at all, because it is a lot of pushback from the beginning of the conversation to the end, and it's all the same. It all starts out with, but not all Muslims are like that though, right? Which that would never be acceptable in any other context. If they had an activist that was standing there saying, I want to talk about the rape on college campuses, they would never say to that activist, oh, but not all girls who go to college get raped, right? Like not all boys are rapists. That would never be a question that you would ask somebody. It's shockingly, appallingly insulting to assume that we're not going to care about Muslim girls until every single one of them has had to suffer from FGM. Every single one of them has been forced into a marriage. Every single one of them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's absolutely ridiculous. There is a problem in the community. If you don't want to address the problem, that's fine. You don't have to. You can completely ignore it, but please stop supporting it. Please stop pretending like it is a good thing to be a Muslim woman wearing hijab on the cover of a magazine. It is not a good thing. It's not a good thing to be putting hijab on the cover on Barbie's head. When I was growing up, I had a different idea in the home and outside of the home. So in the home, I was being taught all of these incredibly misogynistic things that I was taught to accept, and I didn't have a choice around it. But outside of the home, I was at least getting a counter narrative that was pushing into my mind. And I think of the young Muslim girls today who are not getting that dichotomy. They're getting these positive messages about this tool of rape culture, whether they're in the house or outside of the house. In fact, there's a story of a young girl in the States who was writing about how she wanted to take off hijab. She wanted to do it as a secret because she didn't want to get in trouble from her parents. So her teacher saw that she would come to school with a hijab on and then take it off when she got there. And her teacher said to her, if you don't stop doing that, I'm going to tell your parents on you because they want you to wear that and you should respect them and do what they want.
I wonder what the narrative would have been if that young girl had have come to school and said, my parents are forcing me to, I don't know, go to Catholic confession or go to, anything other than. And I think it comes full circle again. I'm so fascinated by this idea, or not this idea, but there's women, not just young girls, but there are women who feminists fight for and causes that third wave feminists fight for. And then there's everything else that they don't agree with. And then wrapped up in all of that is this cancel culture. My feeling, and I hope I'm not being overly optimistic in this, but my observation and my feeling is that that this radical third wave feminism movement is actually in decline, is actually so far on the nose that it's even beginning to eat itself. And by that, I mean the whole Me Too movement in America about the accusations about Joe Biden. The very fact that some of these prominent women who find themselves in a corner and go, oh my God, I'm supposed to believe all women, but I'm not going to believe that one because it doesn't suit my political narrative. And it's this, hopefully, in my view, the beginning of the end of this awful, awful tribal hatred of the wrong kind of women. And which, you know, young girls and women in Islam who can't escape and don't have the choice, they fall into that group.
Questions from the audience.
This is a great question from Tucky Stewart. If you were a good dictator and could impose any laws, what would you do to free the people of Islam? Nothing like starting with a good one, hey?
I wouldn't be a very good dictator because I would want the country to be a secularist country. I would want people to be able to be free to choose whatever religion they want, or to not to choose to follow any religion at all. And I think that's what Islamic countries need right now. They need that separation of mosque and state. I've lived, over 10 years of my life in Muslim majority countries, and I can tell you that most people are not happy. Why would anybody be happy with these rigid laws? Obviously, the women are not happy. Obviously, the LGBT community are not happy. Sure, there are some men that are very happy because they're able to control their wives and their children so successfully. But most people are not happy with those draconian laws. Most people want to be able to have a drink if they want to have a drink. Most people want to be able to have sex with whoever they want to have sex with. So if people are allowed to be free and to choose what they want to choose, I believe most people would choose freedom.
I'm going to run through some of the responses to is the hijab an empowering and feminist act? Cassie in Sydney says, no, the hijab is not empowering. It's not a feminist act, particularly when millions of women are forced to wear it. Mike says, no, I feel the hijab is an oppressive piece devised by men in the usual misogynistic manner of religion. Tiara says, hijab is oppressive as it's not a matter of choice, particularly living in a Muslim country. Aisha says, the hijab may feel empowering for women who actually get to choose to wear it, but it's
Correct.
Certainly not the case for many women who have no choice. And again, Riz says, it's a piece of clothing that only expresses, if I'm reading this correctly, a piece of clothing only expresses that empowerment. So yes, it can be empowering if the wearer chooses to wear it. But if the wearer is forced to wear it, then you're enslaved. So let's talk on the back of that about No Hijab Day. Let's talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, that all started because there was a movement called Hijab Day where an American woman was, it's around like 140 countries around the world now, where they go around and they encourage non-Muslim women to wear hijab for the day. And of course, the opposite of that would be to encourage Muslim women to not wear hijab for the day. But of course, I could never do that because I myself was threatened with death when my mom saw that I wasn't wearing a hijab. And a young girl not far from where I'm living right now was murdered by her father and her brother. She was, in fact, strangled to death with the hijab that she refused to wear here in Canada, a 16-year-old girl. So I would never in a million years ask Muslim women to not wear hijab because I know what the cost of that potentially could be. Instead, what I chose to do was make it a day to support women who have chosen to take it off. Not just women in Iran or Iraq or Saudi Arabia or whatever, women in free Western countries as well. There's a woman in the UK who is a very famous model, and she has like a huge following on Twitter and YouTube. Her and her husband are making these videos all the time. She chose to take off her hijab. When she did that, the backlash from the community was so intense that she has a video where she does nothing but read all of the death threats and the rape threats and the insults and the anger. And the video is almost an hour long. That video is on YouTube. That's just one tiny example. And that it's because she was in the UK. her family is from Egypt. If she were in Egypt, it would be a very different situation. Egypt, they have public transit. They separate the car for the women and the car for the men. And if a woman goes on to the subway car that's all women, if she's not wearing hijab, there are women that go around with scissors in their purses that will go around and snip her hair as punishment for her going around without hijab on. Now, Egypt is a very overpopulated country, so it's very difficult to find these women because the public transportation is really crowded. But it just goes to show you that it's not just men that are forcing women, it's women that are forcing women. It's the entire society. You get backlash from men and women, and not just from your family, but from the greater community, people that they don't even know who you are. Quite often there were Christian women that were getting their hair cut because these women are going around cutting the hair of anybody that has her hair out willy-nilly. They don't even know if these women are Muslim or not, and they don't even care. They're still going to be punished for having their hair out.
And that speaks to the one of the underlying themes that we've been discussing today is this: women are part of the problem, right? The feminist movement is enabling this. The feminist movement, whether they're in part of the liberal media or not, is absolutely enabling this problem. I've got a great question here from Jack. Yasmine, how successful have your efforts been in changing the views of Western liberals that you've interacted with? When you engage with them, have people been sympathetic to you? I would go on and say, add words to Jack's question, empathetic to you, or have they been dismissive and told you not to talk about these issues?
You know, that's the kind of question that I'm hoping to get some sort of, proof of whether what I'm feeling is true or not, or if it's just because social media can be such a bubble. So the people that contact me in media are people that are already interested, that are already thinking about what I'm talking about. But I don't see that there is like a greater, I don't think that just in the culture in general, that there's some sort of significant difference in the way people are thinking or feeling about these topics. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not seeing that. I'm still seeing people talking about the hijab as if it's cultural clothing, which is the most basic argument. Like, what culture are we talking about? Because we've got women in Indonesia and Egypt and Russia and all over the world, people that don't share language, they don't share food, they share nothing. What connects these people is their religion. Yeah, it has nothing. It's not cultural clothing. In fact, when Islam came to these countries and colonized them, it quite often eradicates the culture that was there before and completely covers it up, engulfs it with the Islamic clothing, so that we don't even know what their cultural clothing was before. So I mean, simple things like that, of just understanding the difference between religion and culture, is still an argument that I see coming up over and over again. So I don't know how far my voice is carrying, but this is why I continue to talk, because I hope that if each one of us will just, it's kind of like a ripple effect. If every single person just speaks to another person, and then eventually word will get out there, and it will just, because honestly, when I'm speaking to somebody one-on-one, face-to-face, they get it. They really do. Unless, they block me or they don't want to hear about it. They don't want to get far in the conversation. But anybody that's willing to sit and listen and talk to me, they get it before long. But I don't know if those same people are still going to be virtue signaling after our conversation is over, or are still going to be biting their tongue after our conversation is over. I don't think that what I'm saying is a difficult concept to understand. I think that it's pretty clear. And I think that anybody that's has any sort of empathy for other human beings will very clearly be able to see what it is that I'm going on and on about.
This is from Trisha. I'm so frustrated with the feminist community. I would love to work on this issue, but none of the organized feminist community seems to deal with it. Do you have any suggestions of how an American atheist feminist could help in this regard?
Oh, that's fantastic. I love hearing that. And in fact, I'm thinking that I might even start some sort of a movement, some sort of an
Oh,
organization
you
like that,
should.
just because I should. Right now, I have an organization which is called Free Hearts, Free Minds, which supports
Yes.
people who have left Islam and they're still living in Muslim majority countries where they could be executed for that. So that's where a lot of my attention is going right now. So, but honestly, it would be a project of love, and I would be happy to do it. What I was hoping this whole time was that an established feminist group would be willing to take on this issue, because especially if they're a feminist group that already have a huge audience, then if as long as they just change their narrative a bit, then there will be so many people that will be willing to listen to them so quickly, and we won't have to start from the ground up. You know what I mean? But whenever I
Yeah.
interact with huge feminists like Roxane Gay or somebody, they don't want to hear it. They block me. They're not interested. Gloria Steinem was standing right beside Linda Sarsour in the Liberal Women's March here in the United States, So, but that's
And
what I
there's
want. I
also
want somebody like Melinda Gates, Oprah Winfrey, Ellen DeGeneres, all of these people that are championing feminism and championing the underdog take on this issue. That's what I was kind of hoping would happen.
a question from Jonathan. How do we find the balance between, this is a great question too, how do we find the balance between that biting our tongue and keeping our employment secure, since many in the workplace are run by worksters? So, that I think that's a very, very important question, particularly here in Australia, for example. A lot of conversation happening now around what freedom of speech looks like and whether we need further legislation around it. So, do you have any practical advice or thoughts on that matter?
Yeah, that's a very common question that I get as well. And obviously you have to be pragmatic about this. You have to prioritize things. I mean, I think that you can talk about these things, but carefully. You know what I mean? Like just
Yeah.
try and make sure that you couch your topics in as many examples as you possibly can, and bring examples of women from the Muslim majority world that are fighting against this, so that you aren't taking the lead role, so that you're saying, oh, look at this movie called Wejda, made in Saudi Arabia, the first Saudi Arabian woman to make a movie, and she chose to make a movie about a young girl who just wants to ride a bicycle. If you can imagine that would that's the conflict for the whole movie, because girls in Saudi Arabia and in many Muslim communities around the world, including myself, are not allowed to ride bicycles because there's this stigma that you're going to break your hymen and then you're not going to be a virgin on your wedding night. And so this is a young
Can
girl.
you just imagine though, that
Yeah,
is the kind of film that Hollywood would fawn over, brave
yeah,
and stunning, and then do nothing about?
yeah, yeah. Well, it wasn't made by Hollywood. Was not interested in it.
No, but what I mean is, you can imagine winning awards left, right, and center. What an amazing filmmaker! How brave is she? And then literally doing nothing to help, like literally doing nothing to help.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I would encourage the person who asked the question to share
Hmm.
things like the Honor Diaries movie, which is a movie made by
Right.
women with Islamic backgrounds, whether they're ex-Muslim or still Muslim or progressive Muslims, that are talking about honor culture and honor violence and honor killings. I encourage you to share Banaz, A Love Story, which is a documentary by Dia Khan, which is incredibly heartbreaking, but it's about this young girl named Banaz in the UK who went to the police on 5 different occasions to tell them that she was afraid that her father was trying to kill her. And they never took her seriously until they found her body chopped up in her father's backyard. So these are the kinds of, I mean, people are yelling and screaming all over. You just have to tap into that and then maybe bring those women into the conversations instead of you being at the forefront of it.
I've got a question from Salwan. Do you think that a lot of the left, in the misguided ideas perpetrated by the left, are based on a clear lack of knowledge of Islam's history and theology?
Absolutely. Yes. Well, this is something that frustrates me to no end, because you always hear people say things like, well, Muslims are just a minority group. They are the second largest religious group on the planet. It is really, at this point, ignorance about Islam is a choice. After 9/11, ignorance about Islam is a choice. People need to understand what this religion teaches. And, some people get upset when they, like in America, they talk about Islam in schools. I think it's grade 10 history or something. During that, like a part of that curriculum is to take the kids to the mosque. I encourage that. Do that. Take them to the mosque and let the kids see, wait a minute, why are the boys going in from the front door and the girls going in from the back door? Wait a minute, why do the girls have to put a cloth on their head before they go into the mosque? I want them to see that gender segregation, and I want them to start questioning it from a young age, so that when they're grown adults, they're not going to be fooled by Islamists like Linda Sarsour and her ilk that are standing with a microphone at a liberal women's march talking about how the hijab is so empowering. They won't be fooled by that. They won't, when people start to talk about Muhammad was the first feminist and Islam is the most feminist religion, these kids are not going to buy that, right? So our generation could buy that because our generation was not educated enough about this. And by that, I mean Generation X. But these younger generations, there is the potential that we can educate them about this so that they don't get fooled into these same ridiculous narratives.
Okay, so that comes to another question that we've got from Olivia Greenwell. Yasmine Abdel-Magid, who is an Australian, well, I'm not sure. She's Australian. She's living in London now, has made some controversial comments, divisive comments in my view. She talks a lot about Islam being a peaceful and the most feminist religion. Can you comment on this? You just did, but can you comment on this further and how non-Islamic Australians might reconcile that with a view more in line with your own?
Yeah, so this is exactly what I'm talking about. So she is somebody that I think I wrote one tweet in response to her, and she blocked me right away because she knows that she does not want my voice on any of her followers reading what I have to say, right? So this is what I'm talking about. She would not be able to sell that kind of absolutely revisionist. I mean, it's not even revisionist, it's lunacy. This is the same man that talks about any nation that has women leaders will never succeed. This is the same man that says hell will be filled with more women than men. The same man that says women are less intelligent than men. The same, I could go on and on and on with all of the horrific things that he said about women, but people don't know that. And they just see this woman with her, her turban type thing wrapped on her head, and she looks stylish and she looks exotic, and she says that Muhammad is the first feminist, and they don't have any information to counter that. Do you know what I mean? Exactly. They don't have any point of reference. So they just accept it and they say, okay, and then they perpetuate it and then they repeat it. And that is how the Islamists have succeeded for so long in spreading that narrative. And now we're starting to try and counter it, but really we're out of the gate late because we're only able to start to speak up now because of social media. But for the longest time, they've been doing the work in Muslim student associations all around North America. They've got CARE is a big organization in the United States. There's ISNA. I could go on and on and on with the different organizations. I'm sure you have your own in Australia and in New Zealand, of course, that are going around and that are carefully crafting this narrative. And like you said, those people don't have a point of reference, so they're just accepting those narratives. Well, I'm hoping now that people will be more open to just picking up a mouse or scrolling on their phone and doing their own research. I don't want them to listen to me. I don't want them to listen to the other Yasmine either. I want them to go online, go on Quran.com, go on Sunnah.com and read about this religion yourself so that when somebody tries to sell you something, you know whether they're selling you snake oil or not.
Cassie has a question. I'll have one more after Cassie's that I can see. I found Jacinda Ardern's hijab gesture last year after the Christchurch event offensive. Surely she could have shown her respect without wearing it. What do you believe about that?
I 100% agree. Yes. So Jacinda needed to show her solidarity with the Muslim community, and that was 100% commendable. That's exactly what she should have done at the time. But she chose a divisive thing to show support for the entire Muslim community. I mean, it was short-sighted, and it was actually insulting to a lot of Muslim women. Most Muslim women in the Western world do not wear hijab. And the reason for that is because here they have more of a choice than they do over there. And I say more of, I don't just say a choice, because they don't necessarily always have a choice, but at least there's more of a choice because the pressure will be coming from their families and from their communities and not from the government, not from the laws. But, for Jacinda to do that, what she was doing is she's alienating most Muslim women, because most Muslim women don't wear that on their head. And she's also alienating all of the feminist Muslims that are fighting against it. And like I said, women that are rotting in prison today because they are fighting against it. So that was a perfect example of the subtitle of my book. That is a perfect example of a Western liberal empowering radical Islam. She took a tool of misogyny, a tool of rape culture, a tool of fundamentalist Islam, and she put it on her head. So she is supporting that.
So within Islam, there are women fighting. There are people, men and women, fighting for reform. What does that look like in 2020? Yeah. How strong is that movement? How much hope do you have for a reformation? There have been some commentators that I read over the last week who talk about Islam being poised for a reformation, like Christianity had a reformation, Catholicism had a reformation, Enlightenment, that kind of thing, and speak of great hope around that. So I guess I wanted to understand from you, what is your view on where that process kind of sits right now? What does it look like, and is there hope?
So first of all, we have to recognize that the vast majority of Muslims, so statistically, are supportive of conservative Islam, fundamentalist Islam. There is a very small, much smaller percentage of Muslims that are progressive, that are open-minded, that are free thinkers, that are into LGBT equality, that are into women's equality, right? That's a much smaller group. So first we have to understand the demographics that we're dealing with. And then within that, the only progressive Muslims that can actually be vocal are the ones that are living in the West. So I mean, that's a very small percentage of Muslims, again, because the vast majority of Muslims are not living in the Western world. So, we've got a couple of, it's just demographics are the problem here. There are a lot of people in the Muslim world that I feel, that I know, would speak out if they could, but they fear for their lives. They fear for, losing their, for real, losing their jobs, losing their lives, going to prison, being, killed by their family members. So they don't speak up. So we don't really get to know how many allies we really do have. But what it looks like now, according to, when you do look at research, especially in the Arab world, you see that those numbers are growing steadily. And I do believe that if there was a separation of mosque and state, and I know that the Sharia lawmakers agree with me. I mean, Yusuf Qaradawi, who was a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, said it himself. He said, if we did not have execution for people who leave Islam, there would be no Muslims left. And he's absolutely correct. If people weren't afraid for their lives, they wouldn't be following this religion. And so they know that, as well as we know that as long as you force people to continue following this religion, then they're gonna be too scared to speak out. So luckily in the West, they are able to speak out, but and it is a growing movement for sure. Even in the few years, I've been doing activism for only about 4 years. And in that short time, I already see a huge difference, and so many more Muslims contacting me than those that did at the beginning of my 4-year journey. And it does give me hope. But I think there's a long way to go. And you know what's making the biggest difference? Honestly, 2 things. Number one, ISIS, that made a big difference because it forced a lot of Muslims to see Islam in real life. It's not just, theoretical. It's not just at the mosque on Fridays. We're not just talking about kill the non-believers. Now we're actually doing it. Now they're actually taking sex slaves. So it forced them to, a lot of people were saying, well, that's not Islam. That has nothing to do with Islam. Those aren't Muslims. And then they do their research and they'd be like, oh my God, they're literally following the footsteps of their prophet. And so that forced a lot of Muslims to open their eyes, especially in Iraq. And the other thing that's really helping a lot is the internet, social media, YouTube, Twitter. I mean, it is alarming because, again, we're living I'm talking about countries where close to 100% of the population in some places are Muslim. So all of the education is Islamic, all of the media is Islamic. Anything that they consume has an Islamic flavor to it. So when they're able to go online and they're able to watch videos and interact on Twitter with, like let's say, for example, they're always being taught that Jews are horrible people. And then they go online and they befriend a Jewish person. And then it's like, oh my gosh. And the cognitive dissonance forces them to start to question other things in their life as well. But again, the percentage of people who their English skills are enough to be able to get online and to have these relationships are a small percentage. But as an old Buddhist saying goes, a forest of 1,000 trees started with just one seed. So I do have hope that there will be change.
Final question from Jürgen. Other than your own book, which books would you recommend on this topic broadly if people wanted to educate themselves, educate their friends?
So I would always, number one on my list is The End of Faith by Sam Harris. And then if we're talking about specifically this topic, I would also recommend, it's a book by Masih Al-Jinajad, and it is called Wind in My Hair. And it talks about her, it's similar to mine in that it's a memoir about an Iranian woman. And another book called Daring to Drive by Manal Al-Sharif, and she is Saudi Arabian, and she's talking about her activism in getting women to drive in Saudi Arabia. And I would also recommend The Atheist Muslim, which is written by a friend of mine, Ali Rizvi. And that talks more about Muslims who are trying to be more progressive. And then there's also the latest book by Ayan. Ayan's got 3 books, Ayan Hirsi Ali. I recommend you get all 3. She is a phenomenal writer and an amazing woman. Her first one is called Infidel, and her second one is called Nomad, and her third book is called Islam Needs a Reformation Now. So that's what you were referring to there, Gemma, about the Reformation, and she goes into much more detail about that.
Wonderful. Yasmine, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you as always. I feel like we could have gone on all afternoon.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Think Inc. podcast. For more, head to thinkinc.org for the full showcase of what we have on offer. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe. Your support allows us to keep doing what we do, and we appreciate each and every one of you. See you next time.